Fantastic. Well, first of all, I would like to say for those that are joining us tonight that I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. Welcome to our Scotch Whisky tasting with Edrington. My name is Claudia Anderson, and I am with the Department for International Trade at the British Consulate-General in Chicago, and I cover the food, drink, and retail sectors. And I would like to say to you that we would like to make this a very interactive event. So please feel free to ask questions, send your comments using the chat box that you will see on the right-hand side. But now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our Consul General, Alan Corporation. Alan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Claudia. Thank you, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I wish I was welcoming each of you in person here at the British residence for a wee dram. But until that happy day comes, I'm delighted to say we're able to do this virtually thanks to our friends at Edrington. I hope you received your box of Scottish treats. I got mine yesterday, and I'm really looking forward to this. In a sense, Scotch whisky needs no introduction, and I'm sure many of you here are far more expert in its qualities than I am. It is a spectacularly successful global brand, synonymous with Scotland itself. 36 bottles of Scotch whisky are shipped from Scotland to 166 markets around the world every second. And Scotch whisky exports were worth £3.8 billion last year and 4.9 billion the year before the pandemic. 1/5 of the UK's and 3/4 of Scotland's food and drink exports are Scotch whisky. And guess what the largest market is for exports? It's, of course, the US. To be designated Scotch whisky, the spirit has to be matured in oak casks for at least 3 years. So your future bottle is now maturing in one of 22 million casks lying in Scottish warehouses this evening across the ocean. And these warehouses and distilleries lie in one of 5 Scotch whisky regions, each with its own history, distinctive perspective, character, and taste. With the UK hosting the climate summit COP26 in Glasgow this year, I'd like to take a moment to highlight the Scotch whisky industry's commitment to sustainability and green growth. £10 million of British government funding has been committed to helping Scottish distilleries switch to low carbon fuels like hydrogen, which we expect will lead to distilleries cutting emissions by almost 1 million tons of CO2 this year. That's the equivalent of taking 200,000 cars off the road, all the while investing in 10,000 Scottish jobs, 7,000 of which are in rural areas. Now, I could start getting poetic about my first visit to a Scottish distillery in Oban in the Highlands right before we crossed over to the Hebrides. It's one of the best holidays I've ever had in my life. But I know someone who can do a far better job than me at celebrating Scottish culture. It's a real privilege for me this evening to be able to introduce Gus Noble. Many of you I know, I'm sure know Gus already. I met Gus briefly here a year ago at the residence, just days before the first lockdown, a few weeks after my arrival in Chicago. And he kindly invited me to the Highland Games. And I thought, Highland Games in Illinois, that's not what I expected. Little did I know that they're the biggest such games in the US, in large part thanks to Gus and his team. Of course, last year the games went virtual. So Gus and his organization sent online participants the Highland Games in a box, including haggis chips, and I really like this part for authenticity, a vial of rainwater. Gus was born in Dundee and raised in the Scottish Borders. He studied at Stirling University before moving to Chicago in 1992. He's president of Chicago Scots, formerly known as the Illinois St. Andrew Society, the oldest charity in the state of Illinois, founded in 1845. Gus led the rebranding of the organization, moving it from a heritage focus to a dynamic charity relevant to modern Americans with an interest in Scottish culture. Gus is also CEO of Caledonia Senior Living, an elder care facility in North Riverside. Since the onset of COVID, he's led on keeping the site completely virus-free, including by implementing weekly testing of all the staff and residents. It's been one of the most rigorous and proactive testing systems in the field of senior care in Illinois. There have been 0 cases of COVID at the site, a remarkable achievement. All the while, Gus has been working tirelessly to keep the spirits of residents up, including by having Scottish dancers perform in the driveway in front of the house. I would have liked to have seen that. Gus, it's a real privilege to share this virtual platform with you. On behalf of all of us at the British Consulate in Chicago, thank you for all you've done and are doing for the Scottish American community here in Illinois. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm delighted to be here along with several members of our board. Once upon a time, I attended a Scottish event in Chicago with one of your predecessors, Alan. The Consul-General and I were walking up Michigan Avenue, me in my kilt, and as passers-by nodded their friendly hellos and smiled, the CG said to me, Gus, there are 3 types of people in the world. There are Scots, there are people who want to be Scots, and there are people with no ambition whatsoever. On the 30th of November, 1845, a small frontier town called Chicago with a population of just 12,000 people saw a small group of Scots get together to celebrate St. Andrew's Day. And they established the first charity in Illinois. They adopted a simple mission: relieve the distressed. And since 1845, despite crises like the Civil War, the Great Chicago Fire, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the 1918 flu pandemic, the Chicago Scots have never failed to deliver on our purpose nor our promise. This year, we celebrate our 175th anniversary. We are the oldest charity in Illinois, and in fact, much to the chagrin of my friends down in Houston and Dallas and across Texas, I often say that we are older than the state of Texas. To strengthen the enduring bonds of friendship and collaboration between Scotland and North America, the Chicago Scots, like St. Andrew and Caledonian societies the world over, host events and initiatives that entertain and educate and promote both traditional and contemporary Scottish culture. As you say, Alan, we host one of the biggest Highland Games in North America. In fact, at our Highland Games pre-COVID, we featured the Michael Jordan of caber tossing, a man who, for the first time in history, concurrently holds 5 world records in the 9 events that constitute heavy athletics. And at the same event, 40 different pipe bands came together for the largest pipe band championship in North America. At the end of the day, they played and marched in unison, and it was just a glorious sight and a sound. And my 5-year-old son, I think perfectly, in one word, gave the review that lingers to this day, when after the last piper played, he reached for my hand, looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, awesome." That word is overused, but I think in the context of 1,000 bagpipers playing together, awesome is about the only word that fits. Now, in the corner of every corner of the globe, there are societies that celebrate Scottish culture. But there's only one that's developed an elder care community as a defined charitable purpose. For much more than a century, generations of families have turned to and trusted the Chicago Scots to provide loving care at the Scottish home, and at our new dementia home, the MacLean House. Together, the Scottish Home and the MacLean House are collectively known as Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, which is a 5-acre campus nestled peacefully in the Forest Preserve just a few miles west of downtown Chicago. And here, as you said, Alan, here at Caledonia, our record of safety and success through the crisis of our times, COVID-19, is impeccable. We made it all the way past vaccination without a single resident testing positive. Now, 1 week after vaccination, a resident did test positive, but she had sufficient antibodies in her system by this point that she was able to recover. She was able to take her second vaccine, and I'm happy to report that she is now right as rain and having her dinner right now. That we kept the virus from our door for 11 months was almost unheard of. And that when the virus did make its way into our community, we were able to shut it down and stop the spread was just incredible. It's testament to the commitment and the vigilance of my colleagues, of whom I'm immensely proud. 100% of residents are now vaccinated and 90% of staff. And on February the 9th, we celebrated Immunity Day. And we did so by hoisting a glass of something very good and golden, a Glenrothes from the Winemakers Collection. Now, my remarks tonight began with Robert Burns, and he once said, "I have ever observed that when people who have nothing to say have fairly set out, they do not know when to stop." Well, you'll be delighted that I do. So I'll end here by offering a toast with the same fine Glenrothes we raised on Immunity Day. And as this is a British event, this time we'll hoist the toast to 4 mystic tribes of people who inhabit a small group of islands off the west coast of Europe. There are the Welsh, who pray on their knees and often on their neighbors. There are the Irish, who don't know what they want, but they will fight you for it. There are the Scots, who will always pour a good whiskey on your grave, but only after they've passed it through their kidneys first. And then there are the English, who think they invented themselves, which removes a terrible responsibility from the Lord above. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join with me and let's raise a toast to the Consul-General, to the British Consul-General in Chicago, and to all of you, to friendship and good health. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gus. Thank you for that. What a wonderful beginning and a unique depiction of the United Kingdom. Thank you. I think I've guessed which of my predecessors set out those 3 categories of people in the world. Now it's our turn for something good and golden. And I'm delighted to pass back to Megan, who will be educating us and guiding us through this evening's tasting. Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. I don't know how I'm going to follow Gus. That was pretty good. But hello, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited to be your host today for a very special tasting. Let me introduce you to myself and tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Megan Brillos, and I am the brand ambassador here in Chicago for Edrington. I've been with Edrington for almost 4 years now, and out of everything in our very complex portfolio, Scotch is always my favorite to talk about, and it's definitely my favorite to taste. Glenrothes in particular in our entire portfolio is very interesting. Out of all the Scotch distilleries that we own, it's perhaps the most unusual. It's a brand that we used to own in the past and recently reacquired again. And it's gone through a lot of changes, especially now as we try to promote and share this hidden gem with the world. It's practically next door neighbors to the most famous brand in our portfolio, which is, I'm sure you've heard, the Macallan. But it's a very different whiskey than the Macallan. Despite the proximity and the fact that they're both Speyside gems, that's really where the similarities end. You'll find throughout the presentation that differences between these two distilleries are what makes them both so unique and so special, and that's their history. Before we go into the tragic and tumultuous history of the Glenrothes, I always like to start with a little bit of Whiskey 101. Even if you're a Scotch aficionado, and I'm sure many of you here are, it's always nice to have a quick refresher. Plus, Whiskey 101 is pretty fun. So the basics. Whiskey is a grain alcohol that can be made anywhere in the world. And there's many countries that are making it and doing a great job. Like India and Japan are some newcomers that are really making a name for themselves in this category. But if you want to be called a Scotch by law, it has to be made on Scottish soil, aged for a minimum of 3 years, and it needs to be 40% ABV or alcohol by volume. We say by law because we have a wonderful, and I'm not joking, a wonderful regulatory body called the Scotch Whisky Association. It helps make sure that our industry maintains the highest standards of whiskey making in the entire world. They really protect and safeguard us. And, you know, there's a lot of people out there who are trying to replicate what Scotch does, and they're doing it illegally. And we're really proud to have the Scotch Whisky Association, or the SWA, to protect us and keep us held to these very high standards. Other people can use the word whiskey, and even single malt can be used by other people, but Scotch is ours. However, if there's one area where I personally think that they're a little lenient, they allow Scotch whiskeys to use caramel coloring to adjust the hue of their whiskeys. And the reason for this, it actually makes sense. It's that it takes incredible skill and incredible talent, and it's almost nearly impossible to match not only the taste of every whiskey, but also the coloring of every bottle. If you can't tell by the way that I'm hyping this up, at Edrington, we're very proud to say that all of our whiskeys are 100% natural coloring. So if you look at the whiskeys that we're going to be tasting later tonight, the hues of the whiskeys have never been and will never be altered. The color comes 100% from our sherry seasoned oak. And that's a huge testament to our whiskey makers, because I'm not going to call out any other whiskeys here, but you can actually Google it and you'll find a very, very small handful of Scotch distilleries can claim that they will have 100% natural coloring, 100% natural taste. So go ahead and Google that on your own time. All right, so we know the category of Scotch, but we also know there's categories within Scotch. About 92% of all sales worldwide are blended Scotch. There's a common misconception here when we talk about blended. Blended Scotch doesn't mean it's just different casks. It means the whiskey is coming from different distilleries, multiple distilleries. Almost all whiskeys will be blended from multiple casks, unless you see something like single barrel or single cask. That's an indicator that it's just coming from one single cask. Single malt, which is about the other 8%, has 2 extra rules in addition to the blended Scotch rules. It can only be made at one distillery, and it can only be made using malted barley. Barley is something that grows really, really well in Scotland. And single malts didn't really come into prominence really until the late 70s, early 80s as a standalone product. Most single malts were actually being produced to aid blended whiskeys, and this includes the reason for the Glenrothes distillery being built. We really have to appreciate blended whiskeys, even though they sometimes catch some flack, or some people say they're not as good because they're a little bit more inexpensive. It's not like that. They're just 2 different ways of making whiskey. Honestly, most single malts wouldn't have survived the mid-1900s without blended whiskeys. So if you're looking for a great blended whiskey, I highly recommend the Famous Grouse 18-year-old if you're looking to change your life and or perspective on blended whiskeys. Nuts and bolts differences of blended whiskeys versus single malt. Blended is a neutral grain spirit, i.e. barley or corn, made in a coffee still, if you're familiar with Ireland. And his coffee, he's an Irish guy, he made this still, which he penned the coffee still. It's taller and skinnier, and it's continuous. And it's a little bit more of an inexpensive way to make whiskey, and it just results in like a slightly less flavorful whiskey. So then what blended whiskeys do is they build in single malts to give it some more robust flavor. There's also another category called blended malt. This is literally just single malts being blended together. It's a great category because it's like you have a blank slate or a blank canvas, and you can take different blended single malts from all over Scotland and blend them together to create whatever you want. And thank you guys for this gift that keeps on giving. When the Brits took whiskey over to America, they realized barley wasn't growing as well. So they used rye, and that became what is now known as rye whiskey. And then they traveled south, and corn grew better there. So then that became bourbon. The cool thing about whiskey is that it's just an evolution of the same thing over and over and over again in different parts of the world. The word whiskey derives from the ancient Gaelic word for water, uiscí, or the full name is Uisciúba, and that literally means the water of life. Over the years, uiscí turned into whiskey, and thankfully that's a lot easier to pronounce. The first time that word was ever recorded was way back in 1492, and this is my favorite bit of fun fact here. Unfortunately, it was a record of a Scottish clan leader's funeral, and if you guess the cause of death, he died from drinking too much whiskey. But don't fret, the SWA would never let that happen today. So a little bit about the Glenrothes, which is the beautiful dram that we'll be drinking tonight. If you look at a bottle of scotch, you'll notice that there's always an established date. That's not the date they started distilling. That's the date they got caught distilling. The reason for this is that there's so many distilleries up in the Highlands away from civilization because it's easy to hide from the taxman up there. And you'll see Glen, like Glenrothes, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet on so many Scotch whiskies because Glen actually means valley. And many distilleries are hidden in valley because A, it's a rich source of water, but B, mountains and trees can hide smoke coming out of your stills, and it's a little bit harder for the taxman to find you. That's why you see Glens everywhere. The Glenrothes is a little bit different in this respect. I guess you could say it might be one of the only Scotch whiskeys out there that had a kind of honest start. 1879 is our established date, and that's actually our true established date, which is pretty rare. The founder of Glenrothes was actually an employee at the Macallan. His name was James Stewart. He loved how rich and oily and rambunctious the Macallan was, but he wanted to create a lighter, more floral palette of a whiskey to create a whiskey that could really be targeted towards those blended Scotch whiskeys, because that's where the money was, and he wanted to sell to them. So hidden in the heart of Speyside, located in the town of Rothes, lies one of Scotland's best-kept secrets. It's an award-winning distillery making great whiskey quietly and without compromise since 1879. And as of this year, we're very proud to announce that our 18-year-old is the highest-rated whiskey in the world, according to Ultimate Spirits Challenge, scoring a 98 points. But yet, the Glenrothes remains pretty unknown, and that's partially because it was built that way. It was never really meant to be an attention seeker. It's always about quiet excellence. Even as we progressed from selling to blended whiskey companies to selling it as a single malt, we've kept that idea of quiet luxury. And the Glenrothes is a story of both triumphs and a lot of tragedy. The distillery actually almost never came to be at all. In 1878, there was a financial disaster, and the church of all places bailed out James Stewart because he couldn't afford to build the Glenrothes anymore. And if you look into that, there's actually a very long history between whiskey and the church, but I'm going to let you look into that one on your own. In 1879, the first spirit flowed from the Glenrothes on December 28th. However, instead of a day of celebration, this happened to be the date of the Tay Bridge disaster, a disaster in which 75 people died in a rail bridge crash. And then in 1897, there was a fire at that distillery. In 1903, there was an explosion. There was another fire in 1922, and we lost 1 million liters of whiskey. One of the workers accidentally knocked over a candle in the worst possible place, a distillery. We have spirits coming off the still at 90% ABV. You cannot knock over a candle in a distillery. Much to his demise, he thought that all the people of the town of Rothes were coming out, running out of their houses with cups and buckets to help him put out the fire. But really, they just came because they wanted to snag up any whiskey they could find. Legend has it that the cows were swaying in the fields the next day, and the fish were just a little bit easier to catch. In 1923, on a lighter note, we partnered with Berry Brothers and Rudd. We were a part of Cutty Sark, which today you might know as your grandma's scotch, but she'll tell you back in the day, it was the dram of the 1920s. In 1962, there was another fire. So many tragedies that people call us the most haunted distillery in Scotland. It doesn't help that we're actually right next to a graveyard. But if we circle back to the church, we've never forgotten this tie. And 4 fires later, we finally learned how quickly you can lose 1 million liters of scotch. So if you visit the distillery today, you'll notice our stills are massively tall. And this also gives us a light viscous spirit. But the ceilings are tall too, and they go like this, kind of like a cathedral. And some people call us the Cathedral of Scotch. In 1979, unknown to future generations, the first spirit was laid down in a cask for the first ever vintage single malt, the 1979 Glenrothes. This was followed by a period of vintage releases by the Glenrothes in which we really came into our own within the industry and started making a name for ourselves. In 1987, we launched the Glenrothes 12-year-old single malt, the first age statement. And today, we have an on-site cooperage, and our whiskeys are fully aged in sherry oak casks. And in 2018, we launched what will be the future of the Glenrothes, which is the Saleo Collection. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means later. But you're going to be tasting that today. And basically, we've transitioned away from these vintages, which are a little dated, into a new, vibrant, new age statement line. So we're hoping to bring some great new eyes and some great new taste buds into and introduce them to our whiskey. So I know you were waiting to get into the good stuff. Before we do that, let me just give you a few pointers, a few tips on how to taste your whiskey properly. And we're going to start with the Bourbon Cask Reserve, and we're going to go counterclockwise. So that upper right-hand corner, and then next we'll do the 12-year Whiskey Maker's Cut, and we'll end with 18. But first, grab that Bourbon Cask Reserve. Pour out a healthy dram. You've probably heard me say the word dram a few times. People in the whiskey industry use it all the time, and it literally just means a pour. No specific amount, nothing too small, but not the whole bottle, hopefully. And if you have a tulip glass or a Glencairn or snifter, that's always better because the tulip shape helps the aromas come to the top. A lot of people will just go for it next and chug. Don't do that. It'll burn your taste buds. You'll get all burn and no flavor. If you want to reverse that, get all flavor and no burn. I have a couple pointers. A, do not swirl your whiskey like this. Don't do it. We do it in wine because the content of alcohol is going to be 12, 14, 15, maybe 20% tops. Whiskey, minimum 40%. So all it's going to do is release that alcohol, and it's going to totally overpower any aromas or characteristics that you might get. So remember it this way. Don't swirl it. Don't agitate it. It's Scottish. It's already agitated enough. Instead, hold up to your nose and open your mouth slightly and just breathe in. And you should get plenty right there. Keeping your mouth open is really important. And then next, I like to warm up my taste buds by taking a small sip first. You don't want to shell shock your tongue. Go ahead and take a small sip. And then just absorb it. Take some mental notes. Wait for a second. And then go ahead and take your real first sip. And maybe give it a good swirl around your mouth. Chew it. Something we like to say in the industry. So this is the Bourbon Cask Reserve. It's 40% ABV. It's going to be exclusively matured in American ex-bourbon cask. The thing about American oak versus European oak is American oak is A, more inexpensive, and B, it's less porous. So you're going to get more tones like you might see in this of vanilla, coconut, some softer, sweeter undertones, maybe some citrus. It's going to be a little bit lighter because when we're sherry seasoning our casks, it's not going to absorb as much because the pores are smaller. So this doesn't really burn your palate, but it's a great way to warm up. So go ahead and take your first bite of chocolate. Should be the blue one. Like this. And do the same thing with the chocolate. Warm up your palate and take a small bite first. And then finish it off with your whiskey. It was funny because when we were interviewing our chocolatier for this project, the thing that we think stood out the most was that we had the same exact idea when it comes to whiskey as he did with chocolate. Warm up your palate first, take a small bite, take a small sip first, and then really absorb it. And then transition in between. Have your chocolate, have your whiskey, and you'll notice that they help each other partner to bring out some of these notes. So you might notice some creme brulee, maybe some gentle banana. Your chocolate's going to be a sea salt, vanilla bean, and caramel chocolate. So see what it helps you get out of your whiskey. How was that? Delicious? Really good, right? So I said Saleo earlier, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means. This is our Saleo collection, everything that you see here, and this is the future of the Glenrothes. The Saleo is the process of basically laying out grapes in the sun to dry in Spain. They're then pressed and turned into sherry, which is what we'll talk about over and over again. We're really proud of it, and we use it to season all of our casks. This process usually lasts about 3 weeks, and the colors of the grapes will indicate how far along they are in the Saleo process. The vibrant colors on our bottles actually take inspiration from this process, and they represent the different stages of the Saleo process. So you'll see that our bottles start out with like a white first, and then they transition to a yellow, and then orange, deep red, and then finally like a dark purple. And that dark purple represents the color of the grapes when they're ready to be pressed and turned into sherry. So we're really proud of our sherry because we fully mature our whiskey in it instead of just finishing our whiskey in sherry seasoned casks. A lot of companies will actually cut costs and only finish their whiskey in sherry seasoned casks, which means it's anywhere from 6 to 9 months usually. But when we say 12 years, our whiskey spends the full 12 years in sherry seasoned casks. So we're really proud of that. And you will be able to notice that in particular on the Glenrothes 12-year-old. Paul Bacult, who is the editor of the Spirit Journal, called this one masterfully constructed with the heart of a lion. I thought that was colorful. So the big difference between this one and the last one is that it's an age statement, first of all. And we use mostly first fill European oak casks rather than our ex-bourbon or American oak. So European, as I mentioned before, that wood is just so much more porous. So it's really going to absorb the sherry that we just talked about. And again, all of our casks are 100% sherry seasoned. So if you bring it up to your nose again, nose it, you might notice banana, vanilla, or melon maybe. And again, I don't like to overdo this like what do you taste, what do you smell process just because we all have different palates. So if you have something different, that's totally fine. Okay, go ahead and taste it, and you are definitely probably going to pick up on the sherry. Again, that like citrusy lemon, melon, and then more of that cinnamon from that sherry. And it finishes long and sweet with a little bit of spice on the end, I think more than the bourbon cask did. So if you go ahead and take your next piece of chocolate, which looks like this. This is a sea salt caramel with cinnamon, and that cinnamon's really going to pull out the cinnamon in the Glenrothes 12-year-old. Chocolate ganache. So some good stuff here.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really good. And just note how the chocolate, the different types of chocolate change the different types of whiskey. It really has an effect.
That's delicious.
Yeah, really good, right?
Right.
You guys have a favorite so far?
Better get to the end than after.
The end, fair enough.
It goes so well with the chocolate.
Yeah,
Really nice.
perfect. Perfect after-work treat.
Mm-hmm.
So next we have the Glenrothes Whiskey Maker's Cut. This one's really fun for me, and it might be actually the favorite of mine in the Saleo collection, just because we gave our master whiskey maker, Gordon Motion, complete liberty to do whatever he wanted, which is always fun because, you know, at the end of the day, everything's a business and you've got to meet certain quotas. But for this, we said, take whatever casks, do whatever you want to do. And this is what he came up with. And it's intense, just a warning, but in the best way. I like to describe it as like little fireworks in my mouth. It's really a sherry bomb in the best way. And it's because it's 100% sherry season and it's 100% first fill cask. And I will warn you before you get into it, it is we knocked up that ABV just a little bit to 48.8%. So go ahead, same process. And as you guys transition between your next chocolate, which is the square guy who looks like this. This is also my favorite chocolate in this tasting. You're really gonna get, at least for me, what I get is that nutmeggy, like orange between the two of them. And the chocolate is a dark chocolate ganache, and it has caramelized almond and orange peel nougatine in it. So it is really my favorite pairing of this entire set. So it's really awesome. And then just a note, because this is the Whiskey Maker's Cut, like I said, it was Gordon Motion before, and he's been the master distiller for the Glenrothes for a long time. He was also working for Highland Park for us, and he had 2 full-time jobs at the same time. So we gave him a little bit of a break, and he's headed up to Highland Park exclusively, and he is being succeeded by Laura Rampling. So what's really awesome for us is we now have multiple distilleries with female master whiskey makers that the Macallan does as well. So it's really awesome, as well as Naked Grouse. So we have a lot of females leading the way, and we're really excited to welcome her and see what she does with the Whiskey Maker's Cut. What do you guys think? Good? My favorite.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. It's definitely intense. It's a lot different. If you went from like the Bourbon Cask Reserve to the Whiskey Maker's Cut, it is a ride. It'd be like a roller coaster.
The chocolate and that bottle were incredible together.
Yeah. Yeah, they were definitely the two that I think harmonized the most with each other. As you'll see on the 18-year-old, they're almost opposites, whereas that chocolate and the Whiskey Maker's Cut were actually almost parallels to one another, because they both had those orange and like cinnamony flavor, basically like bursts. So yeah, I really like that as well. But our master chocolatier wanted to give a lot of variety. So that one was parallels, some are opposite. It's just kind of like a roller coaster ride, and that's what makes it fun. So as we move on to the next one, we are finishing with, of course, the 18-year-old. And like I said, this one just became the highest rated whiskey in the world. So we're so, so, so proud. It's the highest honor anyone could bestow upon us. So we're extremely proud and carrying that torch, and we hope we continue to make everyone proud. Paul Bacult, who I mentioned earlier, quoted this one as being the Glenrothes as its majestic peak. So hopefully this is the finale and the peak for all of you. It's 43% ABV. When you nose it, you'll get some orange again, some vanilla. Those are kind of staples for the Glenrothes because it is a more floral, viscous spirit. You'll get some pear and some almonds. And then when you taste it, someone said ginger to me once for that one. I always think it's really interesting to ask what everyone else gets, because we do all have different palates. Somebody told me rosewater once. So some really interesting notes there. Pear, vanilla is something we get a lot. And it kind of finishes a little bit peppery, which is nice. And then it's paired with this Little Red Heart, which is a dark chocolate ganache. And in the chocolate making process, the chocolatier said he actually wanted to let the 18-year-old shine. So he almost toned down the chocolate on this one because he thought that the 18-year-old was such a star. So you'll notice it's very, very, I think it's 64% dark chocolate. So it's a little bit bitter, but in a good way. And it's the perfect pairing for the star of the show.
I can definitely taste almonds and pepper.
Yeah.
That's delicious.
Very spicy. It's good.
Yeah. So as you guys finish enjoying this treat tonight, I just wanted to give kind of a closing statement. I'm so passionate about Scotch whiskey, and it really is an art. The art of whiskey making is one of depth and complexity, And too often, business restraints are put on whiskey making, or time is used to measure the worth of a whiskey. But there's actually no simple egg timer for the water of life. Every single malt is made of hundreds of individual casks that have sat maturing and evolving for so long in such a unique way. And even those casks were trees for at least 100 years before we harvested them and made them into staves. Then they were sherry seasoned, aged, and shipped across Europe before we even put whiskey in them. They aged from a minimum of 12 years old, but most of the whiskey that you see and that you've tasted tonight is actually much older. Finally, the master whiskey makers blend, and it's the finding of the harmony, the balance, and the cohesion between these casks that really make our whiskey great. So we hope you think so too, and I hope you guys enjoyed the tasting tonight.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was really, really fun. And from what I see in the chat, everybody had a great time. Everybody loved the whiskey chocolate combo. Yeah, I have to say, I've never actually paired whiskey with chocolate, something new for me to learn. And it was fascinating and it was great. Yeah, lots of very, very great comments in the chat box. Yeah, they thought it was fabulous and very delicious.
God. It's never a bad night when you have chocolate and whiskey.
Do you have any other suggestions as pairings with whiskey? What else can we, use as a pairing? Yeah. What else?
So I always suggest looking at like the tasting notes, which you can find pretty readily online, or just you can do it yourself and like go through the whiskey and see what you can pick out, and then finding those things like orange, for example, vanilla are two things that we talked about a lot tonight. We talked about pears a lot tonight. Mm-hmm. So always pulling the notes that you find in the whiskey out, and then creating some kind of dish that has those features of those two is always really great because it just makes the whiskey even more of a star. But I also love a charcuterie board. It's really popular these days. And there's even like companies that are doing charcuterie like to your door, like charcuterie boxes almost. So I think my personal suggestion, if you didn't want to do chocolate, because it can be kind of heavy sometimes, doing a charcuterie board, going to get some meat, some cheeses, and looking for, cheese is the same thing. It has those notes too, and just looking for kind of mirror notes and then playing it off of each other. And a charcuterie board's great too because you can pick off so many different things off of it. Like almonds we talked about. You could chop up pears and put pears on there. So you can really make it your own, and there's a lot you can put on there to pull out different notes from the whiskey.
And I think we have a question about the distillery, whether Glenrothes is hosting tastings at the distillery. I would assume that because we're under a pandemic, that's been put on hold, but right?
So I've actually been lucky enough to go to Glenrothes, and it's funny because it's less than 3 miles away from Macallan, but they're polar opposite distilleries, like not the same at all. Macallan, it's huge and almost like museum-like, and it's very immersive, where, the Glenrothes is a lot more quaint. It's like in the countryside. Everyone that's in the town of Rothes, most of them have at least one family member that works at the distillery, but it's not usually open to public touring like the Macallan is. I think you can request private tours, but it's definitely more of a traditional old school style type of distillery. So you have to either organize like a private tour or coordinate with somebody from the distillery to actually get a tour. But you should go, you should try to visit it because it really is awesome. They're just not used to the public intake like some of these other distilleries are.
Well, definitely once we go back to a normalcy, I definitely would like to make a trip to your distillery. We have another question. Do you reuse your barrels?
Sorry?
Do you reuse your barrels?
Not ever more than twice. And most of ours are going to, like 90% of ours are going to be first fill. So we do sell them to a lot of other people.
Fantastic. Do we have any more questions on the chat? I think people are just being very, very complimentary of the event. Well done, Megan. To me, it's really fascinating to see women in the industry. I attended a whiskey event a few years ago, and I would say it was mostly attended by men, but I think lately I've seen more women in the industry and at whiskey tasting events, and like you hosting tonight. So fascinating. I think it was a great experience, and I want to also thank all the people that joined us. But I'm going to hand it over to Alan for his final remarks as well. Thank you. Alan, can I hear you?
Oh,
Are you mute?
now
you
you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And just to echo what Claudia said, Megan, that was really fun. I'm certainly smiling a lot more than I was an hour and a half ago, and I feel the warmth of the Highlands running through me. That was really, really excellent. So thank you so much to Edrington for making this possible this evening with the wonderful boxes we received. Thank you, Megan, for educating us so well. I learned an awful lot. I feel like I had a full meal with all these different tastes on offer through all the different whiskies. And I'd like to thank Claudia Anderson and Polly Benjamin from the Consulate for organizing this from our end this evening. It all went extremely smoothly and efficiently. So thank you so much, Claudia and Polly. Thanks to Gus again for joining us and for bringing your unique Scottish flair. We appreciate it, Gus. And to everyone else online for participating, for joining, and for being a friend of the Consulate. We miss seeing you in person. We look forward to the day when we can see you in person again and host you here at the residence. But in the meantime, we're extremely glad you turned up this evening and took part in the celebration of a Scottish icon. So thank you so much, everybody, and take good care, stay well, and see you soon, I hope.
Cheers.
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 Your good health.